Okay, good evening, everyone. Tonight we're going to look into uh, toward the middle end of the first chapter, Shnaim Ochzin Batalis. So we have a few Mishnahs that one on Daf Yud Aleph, one on Daf Yud Beis, that continue the discussion regarding mitzias, okay, items that are found and how to deal with them. So for the first week and a half, the Gemara dealt mainly with the concept of possession and whose it is, and arguments that result from two conflicted parties holding on to a mitzvah. So now we talk more about, well, who gets to keep the item, right? Like, for example, the Mishnah on Daf Yud Aleph talks about the mitzvah that's running through your yard, right? On Daf Yud Beis, we talk about who gets to keep the mitzvah of your son, of your daughter, of your wife, who gets to keep the mitzvah. And on Daf Yud Gimel, the topic continues, Yud Beis Amud Beis, 12b toward the bottom, talks about various laws regarding, finding shtaros, right? And this is all of these mishnayos at the end of the first parak are like a preamble to the second parak that talks mostly about the parak that everybody has learned in yeshiva at some point or another of Elu Mitzios, which discusses what are you allowed to keep and what are you not allowed to keep. So that's the contrast between the first parak, where we don't talk about whether or not you're allowed to keep them as much as, who do they belong to, what are the rules of returning, stuff like that. So because we were learning a lot of these items regarding mitzias, I thought it would be interesting to learn a little bit about the concept of finding a mitzvah and the mitzvah of Hasheivas Aveidah. Okay, it's a mitzvah that we don't really get to fulfill a lot. Just That's just the way it is. But there are some interesting insights I found on this actual mitzvah. So as we love to do, the first thing whenever we want to go and research a mitzvah, we look at the Sefer HaChinuch. All right, we discussed many times that the chinuch is the building block whenever you want to analyze a mitzvah and see how it is applicable today. So when we talk about Hasheivas Aveidah, okay, the mitzvah that's found, it's number 538. Okay, number 538 in the Sefer HaMitzvos. Lahashiv Aveidah Yisrael. So I'm reading from the Sefer HaChinuch, 538. Lahashiv Aveidah Labala, the mitzvah. Now we're going to see that there is a mitzvah of returning a lost object. And likewise, there is a lotase, there is a negative prohibition of covering your eyes, i.e., looking away. Okay, the Torah goes out of its way to say that looking out or looking aside from the Aveidah is actually a negative commandment. Okay, you can't ignore it. You can't pretend not to see it. You have to deal with it. Okay, so let's focus on the positive. It says to return a lost object. Shenemar hashev tishivim lachicha. We're going to look at the pasuk in Kitetse. Ubibir amru zachrina lebracha. Our rabbis say Hasheivas Aveidah asehu v'nichbal hamitzvah makom acher b'Torah. Now, you should also realize that even though I am quoting the pasuk from Parshas Kitetse, the Torah in Parshas Mishpatim, actually, that's where it all starts. And the pasuk says, "Kitifka shor achicha, ochamoro toeh, hashev tishivim lach, hashev tishivim lo." Okay, so that's the first time it's mentioned. And as we know in Sefer Dvarim, many mitzvos are repeated. So if I were to ask you, what's the reason why we have this commandment of returning lost objects, you'd say, well, it makes sense. And the Sefer Chinuch pretty much says that, but there's one thing the Chinuch says that I wanna focus on. Very, very poignant idea. So he starts off by saying Shorish mitzvah zu yadua. Because first of all, it's obvious what the root of his commandment is. Ki yesh bazeh to'eles hakol v'yishuv hamedina. He says this is what we call a no-brainer. Okay, the chinuch sometimes says, there are mitzvos that if you wanted to start a society on a planet, okay, outside of our universe, and you wanted to enact basic mitzvos, so there are certain items that you would want to include, and there probably are, items that you wouldn't want to include from the Torah, right? This is one of them. Okay, he says it's good for Yishuv Hamedina, okay, society. So far, so good. Why? Shahashikha bakol himitsuya. Okay, this is a great line. I love this. He says, because forgetfulness is a common malady with everyone. It's ubiquitous. Gam behemtam v'chol chayatam borchim tamid hena v'hena. He says, well, right, we just finished learning Bava Kama for 4 months. So we're very well aware that animals, okay, go round and round, right? They go from place to place, okay? And things get lost, right? People forget where they put things, okay? People forget where their animals are. People basically forget all the time, okay? So therefore, we have to have some kind of system that corrects this disease that goes on of people forgetting things all the time and people losing objects all the time. The imha mitzvah hazot shehi ba'amenu yihen nishmaros habehemus va'kelim b'chol makom shia be'artzenu hakadosha. And he says that because we have this special mitzvah that's amongst us, animals, kalim, car keys, everything that we tend to lose will be in a safe place in our holy land. Almost to say it's like an insurance policy. It's like, okay, if I lose something and I'm the rightful owner and I provide, and we're going to see later on in about a week or two, the Mishnah goes into great detail as to how exactly do you advertise and announce that this object is lost. So if in fact, obviously in a perfect society where people find things and they actually advertise that it's a lost item and they put it in the lost and found. So something like that is considered ki'ilu hein tachas yad habaylim. It's as though it's still under the ownership of the owners. Okay? And he ends off by saying, V'chol pekudei Hashem yishar mesamach elev, a beautiful pasuk we say every Shabbos, that basically says that all of the commandments of God, right, are yashar, are straight, and they rejoice someone's heart. Meaning, this is a really, really nice mitzvah, right? Could you imagine you lose something very precious to you and someone finds it and you're so appreciative? It sounds like a real, beautiful, mitzvah that just makes sense on every level. So, obviously I saw those words and I was looking into it, this concept where he says, Shahashikha bakol himitsuya, right? Again, you don't need to know much today other than that, forgetting things and misplacing things are basically an industry today, right? So we all know that people lose things all the time, misplace them, but it's just very interesting. I heard a very, very beautiful vart. This is a little bit on the Agadic side about not, forgetting or, misplacing your wallet or your car keys, but a nice vart on forgetting Torah. Okay, there's a Gemara. I'm going to read it from the Gemara in Eruvin Daf Nun Daled. Eruvin Nun Daled, Eruvin 54. Okay, we just read a couple of weeks ago in the Torah in Parashas Ki Teitzei, it was talking about the description of the luchos. It says charos al libo. Excuse me. It says Let me just, it says Charos al haluchos, right? That the first luchos were inscripted. Okay. So the Gemara says, let me just get it. Amar Rab Elazar. It says, My dichsiv, charus al haluchos. It says that the words were charus, like engraved. The words were engraved on the tablets. So Gemara says, Ilmala lo nishtabru luchos harishonos, had, right, the first luchos not been broken by Moshe, lo nishtachcha Torah mi Yisrael. Nobody would forget any Torah that they learned. That's what the Gemara says. So I heard once that I think it was Rav Shimon Shkop in his introduction to his Sefer Shara Yoshar discusses this Gemara, and he says, it's interesting. While we usually tend to have a negative view on forgetting, he says it's actually a positive thing. Why? He says because if you look at the first luchos, right, the Gemara that we read says that if they weren't smashed, right, we would never forget anything. He says, what's the problem of never forget anything? Could you imagine if all we had to do was read something once and never forget it? We wouldn't work hard any longer, right? Everything we do, whether I'm not even talking about reviewing Daf Yomi and reviewing this, most of the things that we look at on a daily basis are just review. So if we had, something like a autobiographical memory, which is a very, very rare. I saw very interesting on 60 Minutes once. They interviewed 5 or 6 people that have this phenomenal memory where they remember pretty much every single day of their life. And the commentators discuss that it's really a curse, right? Could you imagine if you literally remembered for the last 40, 50, 60 years every single day and what you wore and what was in the news and what you ate? And it's just too much on the brain. So too, Shimon Shkop says the same thing is with Torah. We know that Torah is acquired with diligence. It says, "Im b'chukosai telechu," right? The only way to really acquire something is to work hard at it. If something comes too easy, right, and if we just read it once and we never forget it, then everything would just be too easy and it wouldn't lead to any amelus. So that's a very nice, interesting, at least regarding Talmud Torah, a reason why it's actually good to forget. And believe it or not, I found a modern day article. Let me open it up. It talks about, it's from Columbia Psychiatry. Okay. I just saw this today. The title of the article is Why Forgetting is Good for Your Memory. Okay. Who amongst us hasn't worried when we've yet again misplaced our phone or reached back into the recesses of our mind for a familiar name and come up blank? Our culture bombards us with directives to boost our cognitive skills and train our brains to retain information, and mental slip-ups can be alarming. We worry, is this normal memory loss or the onset of dementia? Okay, Scott Small, director of the Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, okay, newly published book. It's called Forgetting: The Benefits of Not Remembering. And in this article, is just one paragraph I want to focus on. It says, very interesting. It says, what are the positive aspects of the capacity to forget? Okay, this is an article, again, from some, from an MD in Columbia Psychiatry magazine. Okay, tell me if you heard this before. The importance of forgetting is relatively new concept for science. Excuse me, I read the wrong paragraph. Again, what are the positive aspects of the capacity to forget? In a world buzzing with information, it is essential to be able to turn down the noise and discard useless details so they don't interfere with access to new learning or ideas. Without our awareness, and particularly during sleep, the brain is constantly sorting out which memories to keep and which can be purged and forgotten. The ability to forget helps us prioritize, think better, make decisions, and be more creative. Normal forgetting in balance with memory gives us the mental flexibility to grasp abstract concepts from a moral, from, excuse me, from a morass of stored information, allowing us to see the forest through the trees. So he goes on to say the other benefits of forgetting. So I just thought it was very interesting. You hear Vart sometimes from, from Achronim, of Shimon Shkop, 100 years ago, right? Saying basically the same thing when it comes to Torah. And you have a Columbia Psychiatry, you have a doctor writing an article basically saying the same thing, how, you know, sometimes, forgetting is actually benefit for everyone. So I put that in especially for my daughter, who I think would appreciate that. Anyways, so getting back to our Minchas Chinuch, right? Again, why are we talking about forgetting? Because we're talking about Hasheivas Aveidah, right? And the Chinuch says, right? What were the words? Let me just go back to the words that Chinuch used. Was, right? Like, you can't believe he actually says this. The words were Shahashikha bakol hi mitsuya. We all forget no matter what. And here we have someone extolling the virtues of, forgetting things. So that makes us all, or that should make us all feel better the next time, we forget something and embarrass ourselves. Let's go back to the Chinuch, the second paragraph. So the second paragraph, where it talks about Hasheivas Aveidah, goes on to talk about, more of the mundane laws about what you have to, return and what you could keep for yourself. Again, that's more of the second parak. But toward the end of the second paragraph, the Chinuch talks about the concept of Yush. Right? We had this a lot in the seventh parak of Bava Kama a couple of months ago, where it talks about Amru Chazal Lefisha Baila Misyash Mimena. The reason why you're allowed to keep a mitzvah that doesn't have a siman, okay, you find something that there's no way someone is going to identify. Okay, you find money in today's day and age, right? Nobody remembers what serial number their $10 bill is. So why is it that you could keep it? So we learned this, like I said many times before. The Chinuch says, "Lafisha baila misyash mimena." Klomer shemesalik daito zechusu me'aleha. The way the Chinuch describes is that you give up hope, and you're being mesalik your das. You are saying, forget about it, right? There's no way I'm ever going to find my money, right? You leave cash on a bus, right, in Manhattan, and you realize that an hour later, forget about it. You give up hope almost immediately. As opposed to something specific, as opposed to if you leave a box with a name and an address and it's a certain color and you have all these different simanim, then that's a different story. But when it comes to a mitzvah that has no siman and the Baal gives up hope, so the words of the Chinuch is Vareha Motza Tzochim in HaHefker. So he actually says what some Achronim or some Rishonim dispute. How exactly does this concept of Yish work? Meaning the owner gives up hope, and it seems like that's some kind of kinyan, or that's some kind of opening of the door for the person who finds it to keep it. Now, Tosfos, if you remember back in the seventh parak of Bava Kama, we had on Daf Samech, I think it was Daf Samech Hey or Samech Vav, Tosfos, when the Gemara starts talking about Yish, says, Tosfos, it sounds like Yish works because of Hefker, but not really. Whatever, and it goes into a reason why. So there's, back and forth. The Ktos in the Shulchan Aruch and the Nesivos actually explain the way Yish works is that it allows the item to be kept by the finder, even though technically it's in the possession of the owner. So what does that mean in English? Meaning the owner is still in possession. I lose something. I still own that object. I own it. I continuously own it. Even though someone picks it up, I still own it. So if he keeps it, then isn't he stealing it from me? So what Yish accomplishes is that it's some kind of a key that says, okay, I hereby turn over the the ability for someone to keep it because I officially gave up hope. So it's not exactly like Hefker, where I say, okay, I drop something and I say, okay, it's Hefker. Whoever wants it can takes it. Because Hefker, when as soon as I drop it and I leave, I effectively declare myself not the owner anymore. Here, your ownership continues. Again, there's subtle differences. We're not going to get into the lumdus this minute, but there are subtle differences between whether the owner still retains ownership, right, or he completely gives up ownership like he does when it comes to Hefker. Okay, so let's look at the actual. Now that we saw the chinuch, let's look at the actual pasuk. Okay, the actual pasuk is in Kiseitse, Perek Chaf Bet, pasuk 1, 2, and 3. Okay, this is how the introduction is. Lo tira es shor achicha, o es sayo nidachim, v'salamta mehem, hashev tishivem lachicha. Okay, if you see your fellow Jew's shore, right, his ox or his sheep that are nidachim. Nidachim means they're going away. Okay, they're lost. V'salamta mehem. Okay, you shouldn't ignore it, but hashev tishivem lachicha. You must bring it back to your friend. What if he doesn't live near you, or you don't know who the actual owner is? So then the Torah commands, you have to bring it into your house, and you should keep it also until your fellow Jew claims it, and then you should give it back to him. And then the third pasuk and the last pasuk says, "V'chen taseh lechamoro, v'chen taseh lesimlaso, v'chen taseh lechol aveidas achecha." It's not just the shore that you have to deal with if it got lost. It's his donkey, it's his clothing, it's any lost object that you found. Asher tovad mimenu mitzasa, anything that is lost and you find and possess. Lo tuchal hisalem. You cannot pretend that you didn't see it. You're not allowed to close your eyes and say, oh, I didn't see that. I don't want to deal with it. That, as we said a few minutes ago, is actually a separate commandment, okay? Number 539, right? 538 was the commandment to deal with a lost object and to return it. 539 is the negative, like we said, in not ignoring it. So I want to read the Rabbeinu Bachaya has a very nice little pshetel on this when it comes to Hasheivas Aveidah. He says, "V'chol ze midarkei hachesed v'harachmim l'lamet shekulanu am echad," a little bit like the Sefer HaChinuch, we're all one happy family. Ru'uyim sheyeh lanu av echad, with one father, v'shiratze kol echad b'toelas chaveiro. Everybody should look after everybody else. V'sheyachmol al mamono, and be very careful about everybody else's financial situation and their money. Ben shediyah haveidah bal chai, ben shalotia bal chai, whether it's an animal, whether it's money, doesn't matter what it is. Chayvu lachziro l'rashuso. Okay? Now, this is where it gets interesting. He says, the im taskil od. Again, we're quoting the Rabbeinu Bachaya, right? We always quote him a lot. He always has very deep insights. He says, if you really think about it, if you dig deep into this mitzvah of Hasheivas Aveidah, timtza ki yesh ba remez v'hisorus l'inyan tchias hamesim. Wow, he says there's some kind of remez to tchias hamesim. Now it's interesting he says that because the Gemara sometimes goes out of its way. If you remember in the last parak of Sanhedrin, there's no talk about Tchias HaMesim in the Torah, right? Tchias HaMesim is one of those, right, in the Rambam, right? It's one of his big 13 principles that every Jew, if they want to at least claim that they're Jewish, according to the Rambam, must believe. One of them is Tchias HaMesim. The problem that all the rabbis have dealt with is that Tchias HaMesim is not at all mentioned in the Chumash. It's not mentioned in the Torah. It's not mentioned in Tanakh. There's no concept of Tchias HaMesim, resurrection of the dead. The Gemara goes out of its way and brings, I don't know, maybe 6, 7, 8 sources, okay, of where it's hinted to in the Torah. Okay? The Rabbeinu Bechaya says here we actually have a hint to Tchias HaMesim. Now, this is obviously not a blatant hint. This is more of a remez. He says, Shakadosh Baruch Hu machzer Aveidah l'baylav b'acharis hayamim. That God, at the end of days, returns people their lost objects. What does that mean? Sheyashuv kol echad legoralo harishon. That you go back to your first goral or gilgal. V'imi sheyizka bo rishon. Okay, the az yihya ha'acharon machzir avadel lebala. Okay, v'afal pishiyeh sovrim kibalav hu ha'achar. Okay, we get into some Tchias HaMesim jargon here. We're not going to really touch, but it's a nice way of saying that in the end, God will return to ourselves our lost body that we lost at the end of our lifetime. Okay, very nice. So that is the Rabbeinu Bechaya. Now, in that motif of Tchias HaMesim and Gilgal, so I came upon a shla. Okay, the shla says something very, very deep and mystical. He says, okay, he talks about this concept of Gilgal, which we interpret in English as reincarnation. Okay, whether or not that's accepted, most I wouldn't say most, but a fair amount of commentators, do accept this concept of Gilgal, and he brings over here the mitzvah, right? He says, if you look in Parshas Ki Teitzei, you'll see, right? One of the things that people love about Ki Teitzei is you have all these mitzvahs, I think 74 of them, that are scattered throughout the whole Parsha, and each mitzvah like jumps from one to another. And sometimes, I think we had this a couple months ago when we were talking about, right? If you look at the end of Ki Teitzei, you have Chalitza, and then you have the Parsha of Boshes, right? So if you remember, he said a few months ago that the Sforno makes a connection between embarrassing someone, right? Remember the pasuk where the woman reaches over and embarrasses her husband, right? Who's fighting with someone else. And if you look before that, it talks about chalitza, that there you're allowed to embarrass someone, here you're not allowed to embarrass someone. So, right, we make a connection. So here, the shla quotes the Rekanati, okay? And he says, what's the connection between this concept of Hasheivas Aveidah and the pasuk before Hasheivas Aveidah, which talks about burying people? Okay, right? That if you get killed by Bezdin, if Bezdin executes someone, there's a mitzvah that you have to bury the body. And the Gemara in Sanhedrin learns that it's for burial for everyone. So he says the connection between burial, I'm going to read it in English. Zohar commenting on the reason why the corpse of a person hung after execution or anybody else must be buried within less than 24 hours. Rabbi Yehuda derives from this law that if a body were allowed to remain unburied for a period of 24 hours, this would cause a deterioration in the Avarim. Non-burial would reduce man to the level of the animals, as per the pasuk in Tehillim, a man must not be allowed to remain unburied overnight, lest he be like an animal. All of this is connected to the fact that man was created in God's image and form. Were this deterioration to occur, it would on occasion prevent God from assigning the soul of that body to transmigrate to another body he had singled out for it. Okay, this is pretty deep stuff. The soul of the departed must appear before the heavenly tribunal before it could be transferred to another body. Until the body that this soul inhabited had come to burial, the soul does not appear before the heavenly tribunal. The Rekanati connects the subject of transmigration to the mystical dimension of man's creation and hence his burial. Okay, that is why over here there's a connection, because just like there's a connection when you lose something and you have to return it, he says the same thing is true when someone dies and they have to go to their body or their new body. He says the urgency of the burial is determined by the possibility that God has another body on hand waiting to receive the soul of the person recently departed. Rekanati finds support for his theory in the fact that immediately after the passage requiring the burial of the corpse of a legally executed sinner, the Torah legislates the concern that must be shown for an animal that has lost its way home, i.e. Hasheivas Aveidah. The passage has an allegorical meaning above and beyond the immediate legislation. If God is concerned with restoring lost animals or objects to their owner, it follows then that God is at least as concerned in providing an opportunity for even a sinner who had to be executed to find his way back, here it is, and cleave to God and his commandments. This can be accomplished by Gilgul Neshamos. Okay? So this is just like we need to find the new body, you need to find the owner of this lost animal. So that's, we don't really, do these kinds of things with Zohar and Kabbalah. It's just, I just saw this and I said, wow, what's the connection between the pasuk or the mitzvah before Hasheivas Aveidah, and who would have thunk that it is actually Gilgul related? And there's another shla. I saw another brilliant shla. This is two for the day on the concept of the lav. Remember, the lav was lo tuchal salem. He says, Ta mitzvah zu lahodia she'im avedas mamun shel chavercha chayva Torah lahashivo, right? If the Torah is so concerned, right, about returning money that you lost, right, returning money that was lost to your friend, kol sheken avedas nafsho shata arev paraon. How much more concern does the Torah feel about saving the soul of a person from becoming lost? Ratza mizegova, ratza mizegova. Okay? This is similar to what we said before, that God, in the end, is like the lender, right? He's going to repay the guarantor, right? We're talking a little bit of a metaphor over here. So he goes on to say how, again, this is, the same thing of returning a soul. He says, he says, from here we learn, that you're even allowed to make an announcement about a lost object even on Shabbos, right? Usually, he says, we have a halacha that we can't talk about things on Shabbos that we talk about during the week, right? So what about returning lost objects? That's one of the exceptions. Even though that's something that is kept for during the week, we make an exception on Shabbos to show how important it is. Okay? He says just in the last line, he says that there is an additional aspect to this negative part of the command, and failure to return found objects to their owners impedes the arrival of the redemption. Wow. So on an agadic note, we think about Hasheivas Aveidah, just, plain and simple. Here we have real deep stuff over here. What is this mitzvah all about? Meaning, I find an object, I bring it home, and then I return it, right? I advertise it and I return it. So is it the whole process of finding it and keeping it in my house? Or is that the mitzvah? Or is the mitzvah, now the Achronim actually discussed this debate. Is the mitzvah that, or is the mitzvah actually just returning the object? So there's a debate amongst the Rishonim. The Ran says actually the whole event from finding it to keeping it to returning it is actually the mitzvah. And this should ring a bell because not long ago in Bava Kama, we had a debate about how is a person viewed who's watching an Aveidah. The Gemara in Bava Kama, Daf Nun Vav, and we had this a couple of months ago in the middle of the sixth parak of Bava Kama. Okay, the Gemara says Itmar, Shomer Aveidah, Rabba Omer Kashomer Chinam Dami, Rav Yosef Omer Kashomer Sachar Dami. We actually have a machlokes. How does halacha view this person who is now in charge of this Aveidah? So you would mostly think, right? The quick answer is, well, no one's paying him. He's volunteering it. So he's like a shomer chinam. Meaning, if he's responsible, then, we have this concept of Motzei Aveidah doesn't have to take a shvuah, right? We discussed this last week. Someone who finds something, right? And then the person who lost it criticizes and contests. No, you really found 500 and not 200, right? So Gemara says, we're not going to make this person swear, or else nobody's ever going to go out of their way and look for money, right? If that's what they have to deal with taking a shvuah. So the same thing is true over here. You would say, well, of course, that's someone who finds an object, and now he has to deal with it. Why would we want to give him the level of a shomer sachar, which would mean that he's actually chayiv if something happens to it? If it gets stolen from his house, then the owner could claim that you owe me this because you were watching it and you were a shomer sachar. So that's why Rabbah says you're a shomer chinam. The problem is we have Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef says no, he's like a shomer sachar. So why in the world is he a shomer sachar? So if you remember, the Gemara says, "Ba'ahi hana lo boy lemeisva le'rifta la'anya have a shomer sachar." He says because there's actually a profit that this shomer is making. What kind of profit is he making? So the Gemara says, there's a lengthy tosis over here, we'll see a couple of lines, but the Gemara says if he happens to be at home dealing with the shirt that he found, he's washing it, he's doing something to it, and a ani knocks on his door and asks him for money, if he would ordinarily give that ani $10, at that moment, he doesn't have to give the ani any money, and he saved $10 because he's osek in the mitzvah of Hasheivas Aveidah. So that goes back to our question of, well, what is this mitzvah all about? Is it just returning the object, or is it your involvement from the very first minute of finding this? It sounds, based on what we call Pruta de Rav Yosef, which is over here the opinion of Rav Yosef of what kind of shomer this person is, we see very clearly that this mitzvah is from the beginning until the end. Now that we brought that up, we have to see this concept. Now, we spoke once or twice about osek b'mitzvah pater min ha-mitzvah, right? Tosfos is very, very quick to say, yes, on the one hand, there's a concept of osek b'mitzvah, but that doesn't mean, Tosfos says, I'm going to read it inside. Again, if you're following, it's Bava Kama 56b, Mishum de osek b'mitzvah, v'dafka b'shad mit'asek ba. This provision is only at that precise moment when you are dealing with the lost object. Kagon shoteach l'tzorcha, right? You're stretching it out. You're spreading out the garment to air it out. Oh, mishum esek shetzarech la'aveidah, or anything else, an animal. You found it, and now you have to feed it 5 times a day. Okay, so you're feeding the animal. At that moment, you are what's called osek b'mitzvah. He says, but that doesn't mean that if you're watching this animal for 4 months, you don't have to do any mitzvahs for 4 months, right? So that doesn't mean you don't have to give tzedakah for 4 months. It just means at that moment, if someone comes to the door, you're exempt. Why? Because if it's just in your house doing nothing, and you could be Makayim both of them, meaning you could give tzedakah and you could deal with the Aveidah, then you don't get out of the mitzvah of giving tzedakah. There's no loophole for you. The loophole is only when you are dealing specifically with the Aveidah. Okay, and he brings down the Gemara. Tosfos brings down the Gemara in Sukkah, right? And can't do both of them together is when we say Asukavit Pater Min HaMitzvah. And what's Tosfos's proof? Usvarahu. This is logical. Da'atu Adam Sheyesh Lo Tefillin Barosho, B'tzitzis Bebigdo, Mezuzah Bepischa Yiftar Min HaMitzvahs. He says, forget about being Shomer on Aveidah. If I have tzitzis, if I'm wearing tefillin all day, if I have mezuzah on my door, so I'm doing a mitzvah, that means I don't have to do anything else ever. So Tosfos says that obviously doesn't make sense. And that's the story about why we say that, according to Rav Yosef, you are, in effect, a Shomer Sachar at times. That's why you would be chayiv in Geneva Aveidah. A little bit more on this concept. The question is, what else can we use this concept of Hasheivas Aveidah as an application for? So I'm going to quote another Gemara in Bava Kama. Unfortunately, I missed many classes in Bava Kama, so I'm trying to make up for it now. So we just had Bava Kama Nun Vav. Now we're going to have Bava Kama. This is a famous one, Daf Pehe. The reason why it's famous is because most doctors who learn Daf Yomi know this Gemara. The Gemara says, Tana de Rabbi Yishmael. It says, V'rapo Yirape. Okay, the pasuk in Mishpatim says, Rak Shifta Yiten V'rapo Yirape. And the Gemara says, because it's repeated twice, Mikan Shenitan Rishus Larofil Arapos. Okay, here is a source that a doctor is allowed to heal. What does that mean a doctor is allowed to heal? Why would I think he wouldn't be allowed to heal? Well, for that, we need Tosfos. Tosfos says, because I understand that a doctor could come in when he has to treat someone after a boxing match. Okay, he got injured. He got injured, but it was optional, meaning he decided to have a fight with someone. But dealing with cancer, let's say, when you're treating someone with a disease that wasn't passed on or hereditary or whatever, right? That is a little bit objectionable, possibly. Because here it is, God, for whatever reason, decreed someone to get sick, cancer in this example, and here you are treating him or her. So the Gemara, now we say this a lot. Sometimes we dismiss Hava Aminas. I'm a big believer that anytime there's a Hava Amina, there's strength in that. Meaning the fact that we actually bring it up as a possibility means that it has some validity to it. Yes, 99% of the Hava Aminas don't pass muster in the end, but just by the fact that we entertain the possibility shows that there's what to discuss. And here's a perfect example. The fact that you could, for a minute, actually believe that there may be a problem with treating. Now, we know there's, some sects of somewhere in Pennsylvania, I don't know, not Quakers, but some other religion. There was a case of this a few years ago where, the doctor operated and wasn't supposed to, and the person died, right? And whatever, as once in a while we hear about these wild cases where, some people don't believe in medical attention, right? Again, if it's meant to be, then who are we to interfere? So that's actually a Havamina here. The Tosfos says, Kamash Milan Deshari. That's why V'rapo Yirapa you need it. Okay? So if you look in the Rambam, though, the Rambam says, how do you know that a doctor is allowed to heal? Now, where is this Rambam? The Rambam is actually in his Perish HaMishnayos in Maseches Nedarim. Okay, in the fourth parak of Nedarim, we talk about people who make neders against each other, right? We had this when we learned Nedarim about a year and a half ago, where people make a neder against each other. What am I allowed to do for you, right? What are the favors that I can do and can't do? So here, the Mishnah talks about, well, what if I have a neder against the doctor, or a doctor has a neder against me? Is he allowed to treat me? So the Rambam says, he makes a distinction between refuas nefesh and refuas mamon. Okay, he says a refuas nafshahu sheyirpe gufo, refuas hanefesh. Right, the Mishnah says. Let me just read the exact words of the Mishnah. Hamuder hana mechavero. Okay, marapa refuas hanefesh avalo refuas mamon. Even though there's a neder with a doctor, I could still heal, even though I'm getting benefit from him, but I can't do refuas mamon. Refuas mamon is if my animal is sick. So if my animal is sick and I have a neder against the vet, then that's prohibited, right? But refuas hanafsho is rishayurpa gufo. Umutar lo lahagid mashiyo lo behemton va'amnam asur lo l'rapos biyado. You can't heal the animal. Ve'enza asur l'chola atzma lefishahu mitzvah. But when it comes to healing someone else, a human being, that's a mitzvah. Because it's a mitzvah for a doctor to heal. How do you know? So you would think, well, he'd quote the Gemara in Bava Kama, Daf Pehe, that we just saw 5 minutes ago. He says, no. He says it comes from the pasuk of the Hasheivas alo. See what the Rambam is doing? He's taking Hasheivas Aveidah to the next level, right? We looked at it in the eyes of the Shlah Kadosh in terms of a Gilgul and God and Chiyas HaMesim, right? We made that leap from returning an object to the very, very deep and Kabbalistic concept of Chiyas HaMesim and restoring someone's life. Here, the Rambam uses it as a real bona fide halacha. This is the source, says the Rambam, of healing someone. It says, V'hashevos alo, l'rapos as gufo, shehu kisharoa oso mesukan. You see someone who's deathly ill, v'yachol lahatzilo, o begufo, o b'mamona, o b'chachmaso. And you could heal him. Okay, here's a pitch for psychiatry, right? B'chachmaso. If you could heal someone with your chachma, right, the Rambam's alluding to over here, okay, psychologists, psychiatrists, how to heal someone that is suffering mental health issues. Okay, here it is. This is the Rambam, okay? This is the source. So I thought that was extremely interesting how we're taking this to another level. The Rosh says, I don't have it in front of me, but I heard that the Chuvas HaRosh says that by not helping someone, there's a concept of shvuas ha'edus, right? We learned this many times, that if I could potentially help someone, right, by taking the shvua on his behalf, and I don't, right, I swear that I don't know evidence, and I end up knowing evidence, I'm chayav a korban shvua. And the Rosh says you also violate the law of lo tuchal lehisaleim, of covering your eyes when you could help someone. Okay, so very, very interesting. And the last concept on this specific item is the Rashash in Ksuva says that one of the sources of not damaging someone, right? We learned the whole Bava Kama 4 months, right? The very first class I think we discussed is, how do you know that you're not allowed to damage someone? We know that if you damage someone, there's a certain payment you have to make. And if it's a tam, is it a mu'id, is it chain, is it regel? So that we spoke about for many, many, many weeks. But the biblical prohibition, we know that you can't steal. The Torah says lo tigzol, it says lo tignov. How do you know that you can't do damage to someone? It doesn't say don't do damage. It just says how to deal with damage once it's done. But the Rashash in Ksuvas actually says that this is another application of lo tuchal lehisaleim, is not helping someone out. What are you doing? When you're damaging someone, you're not helping them out, obviously. So we actually extend the isser of doing damages from this concept of Hasheivas Aveidah. So I thought that was a very beautiful, um, a very beautiful nugget. Now, just to tie everything together, again, getting back to the um, getting back to the concept, how we started this whole thing about the Sefer HaChinuch, right? With those 3 or 4 magic words saying that we all suffer from forgetfulness. Okay. Coincidentally, one of the topics we actually learned on Daf Yud Aleph, which is 2 days ago's blot, was the concept of shikha, right? Without getting into the details, the Gemara brought in shikha because we were talking about, remember this case where the animals running through the yard, and the Gemara said, well, where was he standing? The owner was standing at the side of the yard, and he had to be there, and we made a differentiation whether it's a chatzar hamishtameres for the chatzar she'eno mishtameres. I hope you remember that from a couple of days ago. And then the Gemara brought in a case of shikha, right? Remember where a person had a worker, right? A person was in the city and he had a worker in the field, and his worker forgot about it. So Gemara wanted to know whether the fact that you remembered that there was shikha in your field, how does that translate? So the Gemara gets into the whole thing of shikha, and I said, wow, what a coincidence. We're talking about Hasheivas Aveidah. The whole mahut of Hasheivas Aveidah is based on the fact, as the Chinuch says, that human beings have a propensity to forget all the time. And it happens to be that the only mitzvah that I'm aware of in all of the 613 mitzvahs that you could accomplish by forgetting is this mitzvah of shikha. So what is shikha all about? Okay, let's look at the Torah, back to where everything is mentioned in Parshas Ki Teitzei. We are chapter 24, verse 19. Ki tiktzor kitzircha b'sadecha. Okay, when you are harvesting in your field, v'shachachta omer b'sadeh, and you forgot to take a bundle, okay, in your field, lo tashuv lekachto, if you forgot about it, you can't turn back to get it. But what should you do? Lager leyasom v'lamana yihiyeh. It should be for the ger, for the yasom, for the almana. L'man yivarechacha Hashem Elokecha b'chol maseh yadecha. Again, another bracha that the Torah gives us is if you leave it over for the ger, for the poor person, for the yasom, for the almana, this God will give you a blessing in all of your undertakings. Okay? A beautiful Rashi and a beautiful Ibn Ezer. Says the Ibn Ezer, Ki natata mishelcha b'machshava, meaning you gave what you thought was yours, meaning you're collecting, right, and you forgot something. So the Ibn Ezra says, even though you forgot it, but you thought that you gave it, Hashem yiten lecha mishalo be'emes. God will give you what is really yours as a reward. So that's a beautiful Ibn Ezra. Rashi makes another comment. He says, let's look at this, from a back. He says, you're getting a bracha? Do you deserve a bracha for forgetting? Again, this goes back to the whole thing about how maybe it's not so bad to forget, right? You actually benefit. You get a bracha guaranteed to you by God. It says, Rashi, hold on. Rashi quotes the Sifri and says, wait a second. You ended up giving tzedakah, really, right? Again, because the unfortunate person, the ger, the yasum, the poor person, is going to end up bringing this bundle home, but you never had that in mind. It was all done by accident. You didn't intend for it. So Rashi says, Kal v'chomer la'osav b'miskaven. Could you imagine if you actually have intent to give? Right? This is a layup in terms of Kal v'chomer land. Emor ma'ata, nafla sela miyadu matza aniyu v'nisparnes. But if you are walking in the street and you have a hole in your pocket and all the coins fall to the floor, and an ani comes and picks it up, Are you Makayem tzedakah? Absolutely, says Rashi. Hareu mizbarech aleha. You surely are going to get a blessing on that account, even though you had absolutely no intent. Now, before we conclude, let's look at the chinuch and what he has to say about this. Okay, let's talk about shikha. Shenitzavinu mitzvah 592. Shenitzavinu kishenishkach omer besada lahaniach sham v'lo nanshuv v'kachto. Right, again, you are gathering the omer, right, in your field, and you forgot to pick it up, right? You can't return and get it. Okay? Okay? What's the reason? He says because the poor people, the destitute people, the people who can't afford, okay, because they are entrenched in their poverty and in their sin, what do? They look everywhere they go. They look at what other people have. Right? He quotes a line from Vayeshev, right? He says that the ani looks at what everybody else has, right? And they get a little jealous, probably. So, whatever everyone has, whatever God gave them, the ani has nothing. So the poor person thinks in their heart, Mi yiten v'hayali ken. Oh, I'd give anything, right? I'd give anything to have some of that. Lesof amarim beiti, so I could bring maybe one or two home. V'lu achat uchal lahavi esmachba. Oh, and if I could have only one of them, I would rejoice. I'd be happy. The Alkain, right? There's a nice build-up. The Alkain hayam chasadav baruchu al briosov. So God, in His infinite wisdom, created this situation, right, to have rachmanas on these people. Lamalos tishukasamzu, to fulfill people's desires. Kishiyah mikra sheish kachena balasadeh. So that if one of them, one of these owners, one of these landowners happens to forget one of his bundles, there's a guy waiting in the background to pounce, to make him happy. Gam yesh bazeh to'eles lebal hasadeh, sheyikna bazeh nefesh tova. This also benefits the owner of the field, right? That he acquires this mitzvah. So it's like a win-win situation. Ki be'emes b'midas hanedivas v'nefesh bracha lebilti teis libo ala omer hanishkach v'yanichem le'evyonim, that he should, right, have rachmanus on this ani, that now he has a chance, right, to be Makayim this mitzvah. This is a little bit reminiscent of, if you remember the Gemara in the beginning of Bava Basra, it says that Pornus Rufus asked Rabbi Akiva, if God loves, right, the poor people so much, why does He leave them poor? Right? Why are there poor people, basically, he wants to know. So the answer is, it's for us to get the mitzvah of giving tzedakah, right? But it takes two to tango. So you have this one person who's eyeing, so to speak, any leftovers. And then you have the landowner who's, who has a chance of forgetting something. And when the two come together, they each, complete this relationship. And that's exactly the way the Sefer HaChinuch depicts the situation. He'll give it to the Avionim. Right? And wow, 9 o'clock. And that's the way we're going to end. Any questions?